Welcome to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety, where we talk about the real issues out on the road, focus on safe driving, and learn industry best practices from your hosts Kenny Ray, Mike Bohan, and Jim Seibert, in the hopes that by driving the line, we get more drivers home safe and sound. This podcast was made possible by Marsh McLennan Agency.
Good day, everyone, and welcome back to Driving the Line, the pursuit of safety. The topic for today's podcast is Drowsy Driving Prevention Week, a week brought about 16 years ago by the National Sleep Foundation. This year's Drowsy Driving Prevention Week is going to be November 3rd through the 9th, and the main focus is Sleep First, Drive Alert. So this past weekend, I had the pleasure of sitting down for lunch with my bride, Lacey Joe. We were attending my daughter's softball game. She had a tournament, actually. And we were in north central Oklahoma and home of Mr. Barry Harrison, the newest addition to this podcast. And Barry and his cute little daughter came over and watched some softball. We got to eat lunch with them, and Barry and I, like we do, we just started talking a little bit about work, and my wife called me out. She said, "You're the one running the drowsy driving prevention discussion for this podcast. You drive drowsy all the time." I like to think that I'm a pretty safe person. I'm not risk adverse, and that could be a bad thing at times. You know, being prior service, being airborne, artillery, air assault. I like to hunt. I like to get after it. I like to go on big Western hunts. So I wouldn't consider myself risk adverse, but I would say that I'm a pretty safe individual. Safety is kind of on the tip of my tongue when I'm talking to everybody. It's paying attention. It's a common sense thing. But having your wife call you out in front of a coworker kind of put me on my heels. And I said, "Well, what are you talking about, Lacey Joe?" And she says, "You keep the craziest hours of anybody I've ever seen. You are 43 and you think you're 19 to 25 still. You think you can still go. You'll be stressed about a work trip and you'll be up until 10 o'clock at night packing your bags, getting ready for the road trip. And you got a long ways to go, and it's going to take you time to get there. So you get up at 3 a.m. and you take off. And I also don't like to be away from home farther or longer than I need to be. And so I push that limit too. I may get up at 3 o'clock in the morning, get on site. I could be doing audits or instruction all day long. And then if I can get home, I like to get home. And I try to cloud that a little bit. I try to cover that up by saying, "Hey, I'm thrifty. I'm frugal. I'm a good steward of what my company provides me. And if I can save them a little bit of money by not staying an extra night, I'm going to get home, especially if I got to drive the opposite direction the next day." Gents, Kenny, Mike, Barry, I don't know if significant others or loved ones have ever called you out in front of your friends like that before. But it was a little bit humbling, a little bit embarrassing. And it's funny that my wife that doesn't get to see me work every day, she gets to see the result of my work and how it can stress me, how it can provide some anxiety, how it can tire me out. And we've all discussed how we're kind of introverted. We like to be alone with our thoughts at the end of a long day. When my wife can see the byproduct of my job and how I am drowsy, how I am affected, and then say, "You're doing this every time, almost every time you hit the road and you're going out to work. You do it every day." I find it funny, Jim, that you're the one running and teaching this podcast. So, thoughts?
Yeah, Jim, this one really, this topic really hit home for me. I go back to when I was in the driver's seat, and I was working 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. and I had a newborn baby at home. So I was trying to contribute and help with her. And one specific story comes to mind, and really the whole overlying principle of this story is just to remind people of the need for a good routine, and getting the adequate sleep. And then, when you start your pre-shift driving, the importance of getting into that cognitive mindset and really focusing on the task at hand. So to tell you my story, we parked the truck there in Stillwater, Oklahoma, and the first load I had on me for dispatch was loading out of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma. I showed up and I hadn't slept that well during the day. And, there was a lot of light in the room. I look back and I try to kind of analyze that situation. There's a lot of light in the bedroom, and the baby had been up all day, and my wife was a little stressed. So I wanted to try to stay up and spend a little time with my daughter. And so I get to Stillwater. I'm feeling a little fatigued, but I knew that I needed to go ahead and carry out the dispatch. So I do my pre-trip. I do my walk around. I get in the truck and I drive down to Oklahoma City. I get pulled into the rack safely. I put the cone in front of the truck. I do my walk around when I'm in the rack, and then I start loading the truck. I get the truck fully loaded. And then I do most of my pre-departure checks, but I get about 5 to 8 miles down the road, and I look down my passenger window, and there's something sticking off the trailer that's not supposed to be there. And the bells and alarms start going off in my head, and I realize that the scully cord was not disconnected from my trailer after I took off. And it's hanging out about 16 inches. And I just kind of sank in the seat, right? And so to talk about some of those cognitive distractions, not only am I a little tired, but at that point, I'm also thinking, oh my goodness, I'm going to get locked out of the rack. So I get to the station to drop the fuel. And sure enough, as I thought, there's the scully cord. And it pulled away from it. It was just the end that you connect to it. And for the listeners that may not be familiar with a scully cord, this connects to your trailer, and it basically wakes all the sensors up in your trailer so that you cannot overfill that trailer. So needless to say, I didn't do my due diligence before I departed on that trip to make sure that I did everything that I could to get woken up completely and to get my mind set on the task at hand, which was driving. And then later on, making sure that I was going through all the necessary procedures that had been put in place by the company to ensure that I was disconnecting everything that I needed to make sure that I didn't damage anything when I departed. So the tail end of it was I ended up getting locked out of the rack for 7 days. I had to go back to the rack, and I had to retrain on the proper procedures for loading and loading that trailer while I'm in the rack. So this one is one that really hits home to me because, especially carrying the schedule that I carried when I was hauling fuel, it really, really was important for me to make sure that I was taking the time before pre-departure to make sure that, again, cognitively, I was in the right place, because statistically, when we drive, that's the most dangerous thing we can do. And we need to make sure that we're completely focused on the task at hand before we depart.
You know, Barry, when you telling that story, like you, I come out of the old tanker industry. I want to share with y'all a couple of stories, and then I want to share with you something with all of our listeners that Mike Bohan has said in the past. I'm going to use one of his quotes, and then will be a launch over to him to share some of his wisdom with us. But, you know, you mentioned that, and again, for people not in the tanker industry, doesn't even understand what a scully is. It's a metering device on a trailer that It helps with the loading and unloading and make sure you got the right amount of product in that trailer and that you both loading and unloading it correctly. But we were loading and unloading sulfur, molten sulfur, in cargo tanks, and one of our customers called dispatch and said, "Hey, I think something's wrong with one of y'all's trucks. It's sitting out there at the unloading pit, and you unload sulfur into underground concrete pits." But said the driver's been sitting there a long time, and it looks like smoke or steam or something's coming off the trailer. And anyway, the terminal manager drove over there. It was only a few miles away, and got over there, and that sulfur had started setting up, and so the driver had connected a steam line to the trailer and was basically pushing steam into the top of the trailer, and that was pressurizing it and helping melt that sulfur that was starting to harden and help it come out the back of the trailer for a rear discharge. But the trailer had completely unloaded. So imagine there's a steam line hooked up to the trailer, and there was a danger, but there was a steam line hooked up to the trailer, and sulfur was being unloaded out the back discharge valve of the trailer, but the sulfur was all out. So now steam's just circulating through the trailer is all that's happening. Well, that steam is coming out, and it looked like smoke. So the terminal manager pulls up in his pickup and gets out and goes up, and the driver, it was a day cab tractor, didn't have a sleeper on it. The driver is laying over the steering wheel using his arms as a pillow, and he is sound asleep in the cab of that truck. And the terminal manager initially was angry with him and got the driver up, but then he realized the driver was so fatigued that while that sulfur was unloading, the driver thought, well, I'll just take me a little 5 or 10 minute nap, and then I'll be ready to go. But once he fell into sleep, his body took over, and he just stayed asleep even when that trailer was completely unloaded. Again, no danger there from a hazmat standpoint, but the danger was that driver was so tired, so fatigued, that even while being in attendance to unloading a hazmat load, he felt the need to take a nap, and that nap went into deep sleep. And, you know, we've talked before about when drivers are fatigued or sleep deprived, that they either have to choose sleep or sleep will choose them, one of the two. At one point, the brain will just simply say, you're not going to let me rest, I'm going to rest. And the driver will go to sleep no matter what he or she's doing. Going down the interstate 70 miles an hour, when the brain says it's time to sleep, it don't matter how much you roll the window down, how much you turn that radio up, how much sugar-free gum you chew, how much coffee you drink. At some point, the body's going to say, enough's enough, I'm resting, and I'm resting now. And they will go to sleep. Jim, it's interesting to me, you started off, and I've had the privilege of having lunch with you and your lovely bride. And one thing I found of being around Lacey is she's an extremely intelligent young lady, and very, very sharp. And I think her observation was quite keen. But, you know, in a way, with her calling you out on that, she was also serving as your advocate. And I want to tell y'all one real quick story. All of y'all know, and many of our listeners know, I'm a retired police officer, state trooper with the state of Texas. My first 10 years with the Texas Department of Public Safety, I actually was a uniformed trooper and a sergeant. My last 14 years with the Texas Department of Public Safety, I was a plainclothes criminal investigator. And 4 years of that, I worked state narcotics. And myself and another state narcotics agent was supporting a highway patrol task force. I still remember it was up at Sulphur Springs, Texas. And the troopers would go out and work the interstate. And if they stopped a vehicle that had narcotics in it, they would call us as investigators, and we would go and interview the person that had been arrested, see if we could follow up and do anything else with it, a controlled delivery or backtrack back to their source. We tried to see if we could work a criminal case off of the trooper's road stop. And so myself and this other narc were working, and we were working 12-hour shifts. He was working nights, 6P to 6A, and I was working days, 6A to 6P. Well, when he went off that the morning I came home, the other investigator told me, he said, now listen, if the highway patrol gets a big load, call me. I want to be involved with it. Well, we had already been on this task force for 3 days, and I had noticed him slowly running out of gas over that time. I mean, he was just because he was working all night long. while I was asleep, and then I was working during the day. And lo and behold, on the fourth day, the highway trooper knocked down a huge load of dope on the interstate. And the person that was arrested agreed to cooperate, and we were going to do a deal. And so this other agent had gone home to sleep for a little bit, and I called his cell phone. His wife answered the phone, and I'm going somewhere with this about Lacey being an advocate for you. This other state police officer's wife answered the phone, and I knew her well. And I said, "Hey, can you get Andy up? And I need to talk to him." And she put her foot down and she said, "No, I am not going to wake him up. He is so tired he can't hold his head up. And if he gets in that car, he's a danger to himself and everyone else. You find someone else." And I thought, at first, it kind of hacked me off just a little bit. And I thought, he's a policeman. Get him up. I need him. But she was adamant. She wasn't going to get him up. And she just put her foot down. She feared her husband getting hurt, and she feared her husband hurting someone else. And she just took a stand. And later on, that story got out to our supervisors, and our supervisors complimented her on adhering to safety when a lot of people would have said, "You're meddling in something's really not your business." And so my point about that is, and one thing I don't think we discussed near enough on here is us being advocates. And I had an opportunity not long ago to watch Barry Harrison make an extremely impressive presentation in front of about 100 truck drivers up in southern Kansas. And one thing Barry talked to these drivers about was being your brother or sister's keeper. And the reason I bring that up, and the reason I tell the story of this police officer's wife being an advocate, when the only thing keeping him from coming out and working was the fact he was too tired to work, Barry taught these drivers about standing up for each other, looking out for each other. And there's probably nobody that notices another driver being fatigued like another driver. And part of being our brother and sister's keeper is when somebody is sleep deprived, us willing to stand in the gap and step in and say, "Time out. It is not safe for you, and it's not safe for the rest of the people out on that highway for you to be operating a motor vehicle right now, particularly a commercial motor vehicle." And one thing, and I shared with y'all, I was going to tell a Mike Bohan quote. It's one of my most favorite things that Mike Bohan says, and he and I have been friends now coming up on 6 years, and I love when he says this. He says, "A driver can be legal but not be safe," meaning you may be in compliance on the hours of service regulations, but you have no business whatsoever being behind the wheel of a truck. So, Mike, one of my most favorite sayings that I've heard you say a zillion times is that a driver can be legal but not safe. Share some of your wisdom with us on this whole idea about drowsy driving.
Well, I like how you guys have set this up to where we're looking at this as something. So right now I'm going to talk to the folks that are listening to us that are driving trucks. I know there's other folks that are listening to us that aren't sitting in the seats driving the trucks every day, but that's who I'm going to talk to right now. And everybody that's shared so far this morning, all the team members on Driving the Line, we're talking about this true danger to you all out on the road of being drowsy while you're driving. And one of the things I want to talk about to follow up on what Kenny was saying there is, Kenny, you kind of, to sum it up, you kind of mentioned that there's some levels to this as far as drowsy driving goes. There's some signs and some symptoms of this. And one of the things I want you guys to hear what Kenny said was be an advocate for your brothers and sisters out there that are driving trucks, but be an advocate for yourself too. Be able to recognize the signs and symptoms. So I pulled some stuff in prep for this conversation today from a couple different areas, but on the American Academy of Sleep Medicine site, they've got some signs and symptoms. Now, listen to these that I'm going to read off here and see if you felt this when you've been driving. And I guarantee you, if you drive a truck, you felt these. So the first one is frequent yawning or difficulty keeping your eyes open. Okay. That's a sign. Is there levels to that? You bet there is. There's levels to this. How about nodding off or having trouble keeping your head up? Okay. That's a little bit deeper level, I would think. All right. Inability to remember driving the last few miles. Hey, I've been there. I've been there where it's like you didn't fall asleep, but you kind of shake back to reality and you don't know if you're going north or south or east or west. You don't you know you're going the right direction, but you're like, did I pass that town that I usually pass? Did I pass this intersection? Okay. How about missing road signs or turns? Difficulty maintaining your speed, drifting in and out of your lane. These are all signs and symptoms that I want you all to recognize in yourself when you're out there driving, and know that you've got a responsibility and permission to say, I am hitting that point where I need to pull over and get some rest. Because one of the other statistics that I pulled, which you guys have probably heard this before, this comes on it's on the National Safety Council website, that they say driving if you go 20 hours or more without sleep and you get in a truck and you drive, it's like driving with a blood alcohol content of 0.08, which is legally drunk for folks out there on the road. For us, we know the CDL standard is 0.04, but it's like 0.08. So we know when we get to that point, if we're not seeing the signs leading up to this, we're not seeing those levels of, hey, we're drowsy and it's getting worse. I'm having trouble keeping my eyes open. I'm yawning a lot. I'm kind of nodding off. Those are signs you need to pay attention to, because you're entering into an extremely dangerous realm of driving while you're drowsy. It's not. It should carry the same amount of weight for you that when we talk about driving impaired, it should carry the same amount of weight, because it's just as dangerous, if not more so. And the reason I say if not more so is because I think it's harder for us to detect and really harder for us to say, yeah, I'm tired. I know when you guys are out there driving up and down the road, it's really hard for you to say, I got to pull over. I got to get some rest, because you feel like, well, I'm not getting the job done. I'm not pushing through. But as we've talked about on this podcast before, and Kenny just mentioned a little bit ago, you're going to get to the point where you can't push through. You'll get to that point if you try to push and push and push and push through all of these signs and all of these symptoms that hopefully that you're seeing. If you try to push through those and push past them, at some point your body's going to shut down. And when that happens, it can be catastrophic. So that's what I want you to hear, as I'm just reinforcing what the guys have shared this morning on the podcast is absolutely be an advocate for those brothers and sisters you got out there on the road with you. But have the same amount of respect for yourself, and understanding that this is something that's a serious deal. We're professional drivers. Our goal is safety at all costs. We need to make sure that we're protecting ourselves and protecting others that we're out there on the road with, because this is, this is something it's a serious issue for truck drivers. I mean, Barry, you mentioned when your story you talked about, you were kind of working overnight, and that 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift. And when you look at what the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration says is the sleepiest time on the road is midnight to 6 a.m. And truck drivers are out there all the time, midnight to 6 a.m. It just are. I mean, there's less traffic, construction zones may be shut down. There's less congestion, less people. So it's a great time to be out on the road. But it's time when people tend to fall asleep a lot more. So truck drivers are out there. So guys, we've got a lot working against us in this area. So I'm just encouraging you to make sure that you're looking for those signs and symptoms, because they can kind of sneak up on you. It's one thing to be, I'm a little tired, but when you start nodding off, when you start just yawning over and over and over again, and you're missing turns and you're seeing some of those symptoms, get off the road, find a safe place, get some rest. It's important. It is truly important, because we want everybody to come home safe at night. That's the goal. And we certainly don't want you guys feeling like you got to push through. I know you guys keep this country moving. We all, the four of us, we have so much respect for what you do out there on the road and how hard you work. But when you need to stop and get some rest, let's stop and get some rest. That's an important thing. If you guys don't hear anything else that I say, when you start seeing those symptoms, get you to a safe place, get in a bunk and get a little rest.
Mike, what if I've got to power through?
We've all been there. I like how you just put
you just talk to the truck drivers. So you guys that this has been your world, your entire careers. I don't know if this is a zinger or a setup or what. What if the work's got to get done? Barry, chime in from your position of you're a truck driver and you are just your schedule, your op tempo has you fried, and you know that day. How's your boss going to receive it when you call in and say, "Boss, I'm tired. I can't make it today." Kenny, from your seat of running a biggest hazmat operation, Mike, your background, what's the supervisor, the dispatcher, the how's that received? And let's just talk. I mean, we're all four men here. I got to power through. Okay, this work. If I don't do this, somebody else gets my load. Somebody else gets my paycheck. From the supervisor's position, let's talk to the companies here real quick. How, as the company, can we help manage this? Because we know our op tempo. How do we help?
Jim, for me, when I put the driver hat on and then switch to the safety professional, it goes back to having a relationship with those drivers and making sure that you know what they sound like when they're cognitively aware. Because if they're not, just like Mike said, you can there's training out there that you can take that you can really see what the signs and symptoms of this fatigue driving are. And a lot of them are pretty parallel to the reasonable suspicion training. If you're talking to a driver and they don't sound like themselves, there's probably something there that's affecting their ability to do their job and do their job well. So we need to know these people personally so that we can pick up on those signs and symptoms very early. And hopefully we're talking to each of our drivers daily and checking in and making sure, hey, are you doing okay? What's on your mind? Let's make sure that they're focused on, again, the task at hand and doing their job well and doing their job safely.
Jim, and you bring up legitimate points. I mean, if a driver's listening to us and takes Mike Bohan's advice and gets to the point where he or she is tired and fatigued and says, if nothing else, I got to have a 2-hour nap. I just got to stop. You're right. There are consequences to that. Dispatch is going to be upset. Customers are going to be upset. Owners are going to be upset. People are going to get mad. But you ask a hypothetical question, what if we have to power through? Well, if we're dealing with that, let's talk about the potential consequences of that. Let's say that driver does power through and ends up piling that truck up in the ditch. Well, do you think then the customer's going to be disappointed? Yes. Is the owner going to be disappointed? Yes. Because not only now is the load not getting there, but now you've torn up $250,000, $500,000 worth of equipment. Hazmat world, you put a spill on the ground that's going to cost millions of dollars to clean up. You're probably going to get an audit out of it. You run the risk of injuring or killing your driver. So, this whole idea about operations always trumping safety. We really need to talk about what the potential consequences of having that kind of mindset is. Because you're exactly right. If a driver calls in and says, hey, boss, I got to pull over for a couple hours and take a nap, and I'm going to be late. There's not a motor carrier on this planet that enjoys calling a customer and saying, we're going to be late. We're not going to make it today. We're going to get there tomorrow. Because the customer's going to yell. They're going to be mad. They're going to threaten to start using somebody else. Everybody gets hot about it. But you tear up a truck and hurt a driver, and then try to balance those two things, the inconvenience of being late versus the load not getting there at all and having injuries on top of that and a lawsuit on top of that. In my mind, there is no comparison. I mean, every single time somebody brings up, well, we don't want to be late, customer service, I always ask them, what does a crash cost you? And again, y'all know I came out of the hazmat world, and if we rolled a truck over and laid it over in the ditch, Number one, we tore up $250,000 to $500,000 worth of equipment. Number two, we put product on the ground. Now we've got an environmental hazard out there, and the load still didn't get there. So, in my mind, there's no comparison between the inconvenience of a load being late versus the consequences of that driver going to sleep and running off in the ditch and rolling that truck over.
It's not a perfect world. It's like when we're giving you guys advice. I know we're speaking a little bit in a vacuum here where it's like, hey, just pull over and get you some rest. Kenny, I'm glad, Jim, you as well. I'm glad you guys bring these points up to where there's an understanding there that, yeah, it does kind of cause a mess when a truck has to stop en route. But Kenny, I love your point you're making there is, well, how much greater of an issue do we have when somebody gets hurt, somebody gets killed? There's more damage being done on the roadside because of an accident when there's potential drowsy driving. I just will reiterate what Kenny was saying. I think we err on the side of safety at that point. This driver says they can't drive. They're fatigued. They're tired. They can't keep their eyes open. We as company owners, as safety directors, as dispatchers, then at that point we have to say, okay, we're going to trust this driver and understand that we're going to do what's best here for them and for the company and for our customer, because we're going to get a little break here. We might be a little late, but the load's going to get there then because our driver's going to get some good rest. And I want to kind of touch on some things that Barry was talking about there a little bit too. He'd mentioned there's training out there for folks to recognize if a driver is drowsy. And I wanted to kind of come back around on one side, because part of that is if you can see your driver face to face, you're talking to him, you can kind of recognize those signs, symptoms, things like that. But what if your driver's already out in the truck? I know there's technology that's going in the trucks now, this AI technology that recognizes fatigue driving. There's lane departure, things like that. So, if you're sitting back at the office and you've got a driver on the road and you're starting to get these alerts now through the telematics of the truck, that's another conversation that you can have with that driver. Say, hey, we've noticed that either something's picked up on the camera if you've got cameras in the truck, so there's a lot of alerts coming off the truck for lane departure issues. If you're seeing a lot of those in a short amount of time for a driver, obviously we're going to want to have a conversation with them and just ask what's going on, see how they're doing, and maybe get them off the road for a little rest, because that may be the issue there, because that's something that we've got all this technology and all this data coming at us. We certainly need to use that. But in the end, guys, I think it comes down to, we know this is an issue in our industry. We know our truck drivers are out there. They're working hard. They work harder than most people I know. They're going to be tired, but we certainly want them to recognize those signs and symptoms and when they're getting too tired, because once they get to that point, we've all said this phrase throughout this podcast, that push through moment. We got to push through. And I know in past conversations, Kenny, you and I have talked about this. You get to the point where you can't, you just don't, your body just shuts down. You mentioned that earlier in this conversation. You just get to the point where you just absolutely cannot. And we don't want you to even get to that point, because if you're driving a truck and you're to that point, you really don't know when 1 minute eyes are open and the next minute eyes are closed and you're asleep and your truck's out of control at that point. So recognize those symptoms, and then companies, be sure that you're listening to your drivers and be willing to have those conversations, and then start problem solving on how to take care of that load. If we're going to be late, okay, let's protect our drivers then, because we know that if they're going to stop and get a little rest, let's support them, let's protect them, and then figure out, do the problem solving on the back end with our customer, because that's certainly something we'll probably have to do.
I think that is time for closing today. Gents, Mike Bohan, Kenny Ray, Barry Harrison, thanks for your wisdom and knowledge and sharing. Driving the Line group here, we encourage you to take part in the Drowsy Driving Prevention Week, again, November 3rd through the 9th. Thanks for being with us, and join us next time for post-crash procedures and care.
That's all the time we have for this episode of Driving the Line, the Pursuit of Safety. We hope you enjoyed our discussion, and thank you for listening. You can rate, review, and subscribe to Driving the Line, The Pursuit of Safety on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or any other app you're using. You can also follow Marsh McLennan Agency on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook. Until next time, thanks again for listening. Drive safely, everyone.